Welcome to another episode of the Contentful Creators webinar series. I'm your host, Marcelo Luan. Along with my special guest today, Praveen Desu from Hasura, we'll learn how to build a music app from scratch using Gatsby.js, Contentful, PostgreSQL, and Hasura, an open source engine that connects databases and microservices and auto-generates a GraphQL backend. I hope you enjoy it, so let's get to it. All right, welcome everybody to the webinar, Build an App Using Contentful, GraphQL, and Hasura, presented by Praveen Desu and hosted by yours truly. I'm Marcelo Luan. There is not much knowledge required here, but if you do have some knowledge of Contentful and GraphQL, obviously it's going to make some things much easier to grasp. Otherwise, no extra knowledge required. That's me, the guy looking up on the sky. I'm Marcelo Luan. Feel free to email me, marcelo@themarceloluan.com. I'm a content creator, and you can find out more about me at themarceloluan.com. I'm also a senior content solutions architect for a company called ServiceTitan. That is your presenter, Praveen Desu. He's a developer advocate for Hasura, and we're going to be chatting with him in just a second, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, we have a meetup. Of course, when are we going to meet in person? I have no clue. When COVID-19 is over, when everything else that's going on in the world is over, we'll meet one day. But in the meantime, still sign up at meetup.com/contentful. And the reason you want to do that is because I send updates through that. So that way you'll know what the next webinar is. You'll also know about the podcast episodes and anything else related to creating. And of course, go check out my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/c/themarceloluan. And of course, I have a weekly podcast where I interview a whole bunch of creators, content architects, designers, technical architects, programmers, you name it, I'm interviewing them. Go to anchor.fm/contentfulcreators. And if you didn't remember any of these URLs, just go to contentfulcreators.com. It's going to land you at a page that has links for all of that. Well, it's time to have a conversation with Praveen.
Hi, folks.
Praveen, nice to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Marcelo.
What I'd love to talk about is you for a minute, so people get to know you a little bit better. Why don't you give us a little bit about your background? How did you get into programming, into being a developer advocate, all of that?
So it's been like 6 years since I've started coding. Earlier back in my college, I used to be a blogger. So I used to blog about some tech products, do reviews and so on. Then the journey went into coding and I joined Hasura. Back then it was a different company. We were doing different services. We were a Kubernetes platform. So there was a little bit of DevOps and some full stack work that I was involved in. Now, the last 2 years, it's been work on GraphQL. So my work primarily has been around front end in the last 2-3 years. So the journey has been interesting because I started off with jQuery, PHP back in the day, but it has turned out to all the modern stack of today's technologies, right? So so when I started off, it was jQuery, PHP, but then React came into the scene where you modeled your UI as state, then all these libraries and all these virtual DOM frameworks. So it's been a crazy journey so far, and I think the ecosystem is improving every day and every year. So yeah, pretty excited to be in this space. As far as becoming a developer advocate, so as I mentioned earlier, I used to be a blogger back in the day, and I love sharing resources, talking to people, helping them out, and so it became like a natural progression from all of the coding stuff that I've been doing and the knowledge sharing that has to happen, and and I think that's how it progressed.
That's quite a journey you had. It's interesting because I used to do PHP as well many, many years ago, but obviously based on your photo, I can tell you that I'm definitely much older than you. So when I started, I was doing CGI, I was doing Cold Fusion, I was just doing, we had the blink tag back then in HTML. So you can imagine when I got started. So Yeah. What
Yeah, so
gets you?
I remember doing Dreamweaver based
Yes,
HTML generation. Like that was 10 years ago, I think. That was back in my school days. But yeah, it's a pretty different journey now.
definitely. It's definitely much more complicated and sophisticated.
Yes, it's right.
And then how did you move on to Hasura? And tell us real quick, what is Hasura? Just give us the 1 minute elevator pitch so we understand it.
Yeah, so the way I moved into Hasura, because it's my first job, technically. So it's been like 6 years. We have transformed into a different company today, but we've transformed 2-3 times back in the past. So yeah, it's been like a full stack work journey over there. So right now, what Hasura is a service that connects to your database and your microservices and gives you GraphQL APIs out of the box. So if you want to like quickly get an API to build an app, you connect Hasura to a database like Postgres, and you get an instant GraphQL API for all your schema tables, right?